What's up, hobby friends? My name is Casey, and welcome to another miniature rescue. The other day, I found a fantastic orc mini that desperately needs help. There are so many good orc models in the Warhammer lineup, and I've painted a few. They've always been one of my favorite factions and some of the most fun minis to paint in the hobby. The real secret is that orcs are never perfect, so minor imperfections with conversions or paint jobs that aren't the absolute cleanest in the world still fit into the narrative of the minis and can look really good. Of course, sometimes as hobbyists we can get a little ahead of ourselves and things don't necessarily go according to plan. And that's okay. Sometimes things don't work out, but there's always a solution. In the case of this mini, there are a few things that I assume may have happened during the process. The paint is pretty thick, which makes me think that the person who tackled this orc might have been a newer painter, and that is backed up by some of the construction issues that I'm seeing as well. The pauldron is falling off of the shoulder, and my guess is that was due to plastic glue not setting after the part was attached, so the piece kind of just slid down the shoulder and finally settled into this odd position. All in all, these are pretty common mistakes when someone starts painting, and after building and painting a few more models, these are things that are quickly overcome. If you are having these types of issues, don't worry about it. Just keep building and painting and try to be as clean as you can during that process. You will get better with each mini. And of course, don't forget to thin your paints. I picked up this Ork Warboss off of eBay for 14 bucks, which is a pretty good deal even with some of the missing parts. Specifically, the little goblin that sits on top of his back is gone, but I think I have a few extras laying around that will take care of that. The first thing to do will be to replace that goblin, and luckily I already know that I have some of those little guys with guns laying around from the old green Stompa project from last October. The other major missing piece is the metal icon that also sits on his back. Now I rummaged through some of the bits and happened to come across a nice orky metal banner that will do the job perfectly. It's got 2 poles instead of 1 and will need to be cut down in order to work, but that's really no big deal. There are other issues as well, but we need to remove the paint to really get a good look at what's going on. I'll be stripping the model using an ultrasonic cleaner filled with LA's Totally Awesome, which is a concentrated degreaser that does a really good job even without the sonic cleaner to help. I let the sonic cleaner run for a solid 20 minutes before using a toothbrush to scrub away the paint. And there really was a ton of paint on this model. It looks like it was fully painted several times, maybe in an attempt to try and figure out different colors. I see reds, blues, and after taking off a few layers, quite a bit of yellow. There also looks to be quite a bit of teal on the model, so I'm wondering if this model may have been used as an attempt to get someone's kid into miniature painting. I almost always have a few models ready to go lying around in my space just in case my son wants to try painting.
Hi, my name is Box. We're gonna do something really special. Paint this model.
When he comes into my office, he can look through a few and decide what colors he wants to use. I load up a palette for him, give him a cup of water, and off he goes. He's actually painted a fair amount of models at this point, and I can tell that even with a little bit of experience, he's actually improving with each model.
This is a plague monk. I want to paint this model with brown.
I can let him paint a model however he wants. Of course, I'm there to help him along, show him how to thin paints and hold the brush, but he's gonna make the decisions for the model. When the paint's dry, he might decide to change colors, which is great. So he paints over what's already there or just moves on to another model.
Why I painted the sword brown? Because it looks rusty. He looks icky.
I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case with this orc, just because of how many layers and colors there were. But whatever it was, we're going to scrub this guy clean and start the repairs.
My name's Fox and I will see you in the next video.
There are 3 things that need to be done to get this Warboss back onto the tabletop, not including the paint. The broken standard poles need to be snipped off, shaved down, and replaced with a new one. The little goblin we have as a replacement for the original needs to be put on top of the model. And there are some gaps in the armor panels where the parts of the model didn't quite get pushed together all the way. I wanted to try and take them apart, but there was definitely plastic glue used to weld these pieces together, and I'd rather not cut into it just to put it back together. So some gap filling will need to be done using Milliput. I like Milliput for its versatility. It's water soluble when wet, so it can be smoothed into cracks and crevices very easily by hand, and it dries in about 4 hours, so it's quick compared to other solutions. In hard to reach places, I used an old brush dipped in some water to go over the top of that Milliput and make it as smooth as I can. This fills the gaps nicely and we can move on to adding the other parts. I cut down the new standard for the back of the armor. The bottom of the piece was cut flat and I just glued it into the same position that the original would have been in. It doesn't fit perfectly because this one has the 2 icons on top, so instead of 1 pole there's 2, but that's alright. I used some of the leftover Milliput to wrap around the bottom and make it look like it was a little more integrated into the armor. There was a small gap in one of the corners and that won't be an issue anymore. Finally, the goblin needs to be placed on top of the model. The way that this model is standing made it pretty easy to set on top of that flat piece of armor, although where the gun that the original model has connected to that panel needed to be cut off completely to make room for the new one's foot. Since this model is holding a gun already, it definitely looks very similar to the other one, though I do find it pretty funny that he might be holding some kind of repair gun and not an actual gun. But it totally works for me and definitely plays into the Goblin Ork dynamic. The last thing to do before getting this model primed is to add a quick bit of basing material. I load the base up with PVA and dip the entire thing into a bucket of beach sand. The variety in sand and rocks is great for doing bases really quickly. It takes a minute to dry, but since the Milliput still has a little while left on it, we'll just set this guy aside for a few more hours and then start priming. Before we get to the painting, let me tell you about today's excellent sponsor, CMO Games. CMO Games is an epic hobby store that has been selling online for more than 20 years. They focus on Games Workshop products, almost always selling at 15% off, and they carry a wide variety of paints and supplies to get those minis painted. On top of a ton of tabletop games, board games, and TCGs, they carry hobby supplies. Pro Acryl, Vallejo, and Scale 75 just to name a few. So you can always find the supplies and paints that you need and get them shipped quickly and at a good price. CMO Games also takes care of your pre-orders. So if you need to get in on the newest Games Workshop release, they go live at 12:01 a.m. on the absolute earliest day possible so you don't miss out. Head on over to cmogames.com using the affiliate link in the description below and check out this fantastic store. Using my link won't cost you anything extra, but greatly helps out the channel, so thank you. Thank you CMO Games for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to that epic Warboss. There are a couple of things I want to do with this paint job. The last colors put onto the model were red and blue, so I want to give this guy a nice red armor and bring in blue as an accent. I'll start with a blue-gray undercoat, only because I ran out of black, but this does help with keeping the armor a bit brighter and will make it easier to paint in the skin later on, so no big deal. Dark red will go on over all of the armor, working it up slowly and thin to make sure that we don't clog any details. After that, I'll use a mid-tone red to fill in most of the armor again, just leaving the bottom of things that darker red. The blue in the primer gives the red a nice purple in the shadows, and I want to preserve that as much as I can. Later on, I will push those shadows a bit more, but it's already starting off in a good place. Finally, some orange to finish off the sharpest edges of the armor. I tried to place this color pretty sparingly. Too much and the armor quickly shifts into looking completely orange. So just the edges of the armor and right at the highlight points of the shoulder pads. The armor is pretty much done for now, so I want to start filling in those details. I'm going to start with a bright silver for all the mechanical stuff on the model. There is quite a lot of it, and some of it has armor separating the little pistons and gears. I really like models like this because when you paint that initial layer for armor, you get these really nicely painted panels that you just paint around. It just saves time and you get a very cohesive color for all the panels because they were done at the same time with the same colors. Not that you can't just use a paintbrush and do the exact same thing, it's just one of those little satisfactions of owning an airbrush. One of the reasons why I think people should be using them, even if it's just to base coat a model. Now that I can see all of the parts and pieces of the armor much better with that metallic separation, I'll come back in with some of that orange and edge highlight each panel. Now that really brings the armor out and gives it that final punch of color. Ork skin can go a lot of different directions, but for maximum contrast I'll be sticking with the traditional green workup, starting off with a dark green base and working my way up to a yellow green. After the dark green dries, I'll bring in some army paint or speed paint and use that as a wash for the skin. Using the speed paint or contrast is great for adding more saturation and giving you that clear separation of the muscles. I like to use this for orcs and goblins because they generally have very defined muscles and take contrast and speed paints really well. The green is much more saturated too, and I can take a little bit of brighter green and mix it into that speed paint for a highlight. It's nice because you can be kind of glazy about it, if you will, and mix your paints brighter and brighter while keeping that thin consistency and stick of a contrast type paint. You can pull and push that pigment around like a glaze and let the brightest part settle exactly where it needs to be. So on this guy's face, I thin down that initial speed paint with a brighter green yellow, and you can see how it just slides into place while layering up pretty nicely. After getting a nice layer on top of the skin, I take the pure yellow green and bring out the details. This orc has a really nice face, extremely paintable with easier than normal lines to follow. The actual sculpting here is very nice, and I love the way that it kind of shows you exactly what needs to be painted and how. I want to start bringing in more blue to the model, and continuing on the face, I'll use some contrast achromatic blue to glaze into the shadows. This will separate everything even more and give that face a nice cold blue look that takes the contrast even further from the armor. Cold shadows and green skin play nicely off of the warm red armor and make the face really stand out. For the rest of the model, I'm going to airbrush in even more blue. I want the metallics especially to have that blue tint to them, and when shooting this on the armor, it pushes those slightly purple shadows even more and makes them look pretty nice. Using the blue on the skin also brings in a lot more color variety and brings out the blue glazing a lot more. At this point, I do like the way that this model is looking, and it's time to start adding in the final details. Any kind of weathering and panel lining will help sell this guy even more. Tamiya panel liner is my go-to for bright metallics. I like to lay it on pretty thick and really get the metallics covered. Then come back in with a brush load of mineral spirits to move that black around and even it out a bit. The panel liner gets into all the little details and brings out a lot more detail in the model, and it kind of gives it an overall filtered look with the black color. I also like a little bit more weathering. My orcs are usually pretty rusty, and I want to add a bit more color to the metallics because they're really bright right now, especially the motor on his back. I watered down some dirty down rust and put that down onto the metallics. I don't want to take this color down too far because I like the blue in that metal, but we can kind of play around with a mix of orange rust and blue and come up with something pretty neat. After all of that dries, I can come back in with a bright silver and dry brush over the rust to polish that metal and make it look a little bit cleaner, just leaving the rust and grime in a lot of the recesses. For the base, I decided to go a small step above simple. I covered the rocks with some pigment powder and used a wet brush to push that into the cracks. The pigments will stay there more permanently and cover up any of the rock. We can bring in some dried pigments onto the armor to tie it all in. Then I'll take a few grass tufts and stick them down on the base to give it a little more variety, finally dusting the whole thing with a little bit of static grass to tie it all together. Pretty straightforward and nothing too over the top. I'm still not sure if I'm going to actually end up using this model in my personal orc army or not. I already have a nice Warboss and even another one of these exact ones still on the sprue. So I don't want to fully commit on a base just yet. For now though, this project is done, and I feel like it turned out pretty well. Whether it was the intention of the original owner to paint up a sweet Warboss in red armor with blue accents, I really can't say, but we took what was there and turned it into something really fun. When you start out in miniature painting, it can be difficult to begin to grasp some of the concepts of the hobby. Thinning paints to the proper consistency, applying thin layers, keeping your brush where you want it, all of these things are just learned over the course of trying. Don't let those early paint jobs discourage you. It just takes time to figure some of this stuff out, and that's part of the fun. This model is a great example of just having too much paint on it. Thick layers were put on, and the paint started to smooth out the details to the point that even if it were thinned, painting over it wasn't going to help. What I think is a really good sign though, is that the person who painted this orc before kept at it. There's plenty of evidence that the colors we got were definitely not the first to go down. So paint went down that they didn't like, but they kept going, trying new things and seeing what would work and what didn't work, what colors they like. Even if things don't go the way you wanted or expected, just be like that person. Just keep trying. Thank you again for joining me on another miniature rescue. If you like something about this video, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, as it really helps out the channel. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video. And of course, here is the completed Warboss in Mega Armor. Thanks again.